Hello everyone. This workshop is titled Outer Inner Space, Deaf Perspective and Deconstruction. In the past, we have had workshops discussing deconstruction and phonocentrism. Now we will take a broader look at the outer and inner space and the space in between, which is where we find expressions of art, filmmaking, performance art, literature. Let's discuss the concepts of outer and inner space and the space in between. We've gathered a number of times over the years. Of course, the world is ever evolving and so many things have happened. An obvious one is the COVID-19 pandemic, which changed our lives. Another is the Black Lives Matter movement, which affected people globally. Then in Hong Kong, the protests fighting for their human rights and the value they have for democracy and demands for democratic reform. They protested because of the fear of losing their autonomy from China. Their strength, resiliency, and sense of spirit was amazing. In 2020, these world events changed everything. They had major influences on our art, everyday life, and our awareness in general. So that is the broader look of our world. Now let's focus on how we navigate through outer and inner space and the intersectionality with identity. When we gathered, we discussed identity and specifically deaf identity. Deconstructing the identity and experiences as deaf artists, eliminating the belief of phonocentrism, and challenging our views on deaf identity. We looked at it from all different perspectives, being aware of other identities and focusing mainly on the deaf identity. You may relate to a couple of identities and perhaps even multiple identities. But it is more the intersectionality of these identities and how we navigate through these spaces. Instead of focusing on one identity, the deaf identity, it is more about the intersectionality of all identities, looking at each individual's own intersectionality and how that influences their art practice. Now let's look at the concept of space. The idea of outer space occurs in our everyday life. This includes going to work and our life at home. When COVID happened, it impacted our lives and all of the spaces we knew changed. People were reevaluating their workspaces and discussed how to adjust. We cannot separate our outer and inner spaces because they are interconnected. When we think of outer space, it is the physical space around us that we occupy. Before COVID, we would commute to work, driving our cars, then commute back home to where we lived. We have various spaces in our house: kitchen, living room, family room. Some artists work from home and have a dedicated studio space in their home. Some already had home studios before, and some made the change recently. More and more people were choosing to or had to work remotely from home. Some artists already had a home studio set up in their house before COVID. Others used studio space outside of their home. It really varied depending on where you lived and the space you had available. A question for you is, how did the COVID-19 pandemic change the spaces for you? What changed? Is it the same as before? Were there slight modifications, or was there a big change? What was the change? Just something to think about and discuss amongst yourselves. Now, looking at your home space, your art studio, and general art practice, do you feel that there was any change to your workflow? Do you feel that you're able to create easily, or do you struggle to work through the creation process? Consider those situations, and if you did have challenges, how did you overcome them? If you were able to work around them, any strategies you can share that perhaps others haven't thought about before? You may have a studio space set up and it's a great place to work, except for the fact that there is carpet. This creates a mental block for you because it might be difficult to move things around, and it is something that you can't help noticing, thinking about, and is irritating. You may have another room with wooden floors, but just isn't the right space. In the end, you decide it's time to remove the carpet and lay down some wooden flooring. That solves the problem of the carpet. The other room is a great space, but in the afternoon and evening, it doesn't get enough light. In looking for some lighting, you find a nice floor lamp that brightens the room perfectly without ugly cords showing. Now you have made the changes in both rooms and have more space to work in. Problem solved. Those were just examples on how you can solve the problems and make changes in your environment to improve your workflow. How do you make things work in your own art practice? Now let's look at our inner space, our identity. We have gone in depth discussing our deaf identity, but don't forget, there are other identities that we also possess. You may connect more with one identity over another, and it varies with everyone. Now make a list of all the identities that you relate to. In one column, list the identities you think are privileged. In the other column, list the oppressed identities. For example, I identify as deaf. I place it in the oppressed identity column. As a woman, I also put that in the oppressed identity column. Identifying as a mother, I think it can go in both columns. I also identify as an immigrant, having been born in another country. I would also put that in the oppressed identity group. An ASL teacher, privileged. As an artist, either column. Sometimes my art is not valued and I feel oppressed. Other times, my art is praised and I feel privileged. Regardless if you relate to an identity a little bit or a lot, list all of your identities in these columns. You can list everything from identities you strongly relate with to identities that may seem like a big part of you that you may not think very much about. Once you are done listing them out, I want you to think about your everyday life, your interactions, your art practice, creating art. Do you think about all your identities or just focus on your deaf identity? Suppose you're creating an art piece. Make a painting, for example. If what you are creating speaks to the oppression and experiences of a deaf person, then clearly it is focusing on the deaf identity. You could be visually depicting your experience growing up as a deaf person in a classroom with hearing teacher and with hearing classmates, and how even the setup of the classroom in rows can feel oppressive. You can express how you felt oppressed in that environment as a deaf person. But there could be other identities that you relate to and realize that you have a connection with someone based on your background or color of your skin. Is that something important for you to point out? Or is it not an identity that is apparent in your art? Just some things to think about. Of course, there's an identity that I'm sure you wrote down, and that is your identity as an artist. Does that word truly describe how you identify as an artist? Or is there another word that describes you and your art practice differently? It could be bang on, or it could be another word completely. For example, one may identify as an artist and a writer. Put some thought into how you identify as it relates to your professional work as an artist. Once you have thought about it and listed your identities, we will discuss as a group. We will discuss different perspectives on identity and intersectionality and deconstruct the meaning of those words. Challenge and unpack the beliefs that we have become accustomed to and gain new insight on what identity is. Through that reconstruction, we will redefine our identities with a new perspective. I look forward to our discussions.